All right, thank you very much. So today I'm going to talk about predicting bottom current deposition and erosion on the ocean floor. It's a numerical modeling study that is not about turbidites, so I'm not entirely sure if Arnold Bouma would enjoy the talk, but maybe some people here will enjoy the talk. Yeah, so my name is Daan Beelen. I'm an assistant professor in Utrecht University, and I'm doing this work together with Professor Leslie Wood, who is at the Colorado School of Mines. Now, at this point, I think most, if not all, of the viewers are probably familiar with Contourites and what Contourites are exactly. So they're basically sedimentary systems that form under the action of deep marine bottom currents, which are typically thermohaline in nature, and they almost always form across a spectrum between these continuous bottom currents and gravitationally driven turbidity currents. So two examples that are completely different are on the top left, the Cabo Albufeira moat and drift system off the coast of Portugal. And then on the right side of the slide, you see what's also considered a contourite, but has a completely different geomorphology, which I would classify as an abyssal dunefield system. Now, both of these are driven to some extent by these bottom currents, right? So this concept that we have both gravitational currents and continuous bottom currents interacting is very important in this talk. Now, the reason that these types of systems are really important is actually because the Earth, the largest depositional environment on Earth by far is, of course, the deep marine realm. In fact, most of the Earth is the deep marine realm. About half of the Earth is covered with abyssal plain, and a lot of this is very poorly mapped and poorly understood. So being able to predict where the deposition and erosion of these currents occurs can give you lots of ideas and can kind of fill in the blank spots of the map, right? Now, someone from the USGS also told me that especially being able to predict where bottom current erosion takes place is very important for potential future deep sea mining, because these areas that have these ferromanganese nodules, for example, on the right picture in this slide, they tend to form where there's very strong erosional bottom currents, right? Because they deflate all the sediment around the nodules. And these nodules can actually be very important in the near future because they're a source of cobalt, rare earth minerals, things like that. Okay, now if you want to make a contourite or a bottom current deposit, you basically need two ingredients. And the first is an amount of shear stress, which, as I said previously, comes mostly from this thermohaline conveyor, although other processes like deep tides and potentially benthic storms also play an important role. The second ingredient you need is a sediment supply, which sounds very obvious from a sedimentological perspective, but many regions in the deep marine realm, think about like mid-oceanic ridges, things like that, they have very, very little sediment supply. So little that you cannot really make any sort of deposit, right? This concept has been around, that you need this concept of these two ingredients has been around for a while. So the left image is adapted from a 1993 paper. A slightly newer version of this concept is portrayed in this 2004 diagram, which kind of shows the same, right? These contourites, these bottom current deposits, they form and they exist in some regime of sediment supply and current activity, right? So if you want to predict them, we need to have quantitative control of these two parameters, of these ingredients. So for my prediction model, I use several data sets. The first is a data set from the HYCOM, the Hybrid Coordinate Ocean Model, which is a global circulation model. It's a very, very complicated model. And it is able to predict to quite reasonable accuracy the amount of force that the bottom currents exert on the ocean floor across the entire world, right? So I don't really use the model itself. I use just one model run that has the amount of shear stress exerted by bottom currents across the entire ocean. Another data set, the other data sets I use are to model sediment supply, which is the sediment thickness model, the GlobSed 3, which uses interpolated seismic sections and ocean drill cores that give an idea of how much sediment is on the ocean. Now, of course, older pieces of oceanic crust have had more time to collect the sediment. So if you want to figure out the sediment supply, then you have to divide the thickness of the sediment by the age of the crust. And fortunately, there's also very good quantitative control on that one. Finally, in order to train the model, we need some idea of the dispersal of contourites, and that comes from the Contourite Atlas, which is published now its third iteration in 2019. So all these data sets were collected and then modified to fit an identical template, which is a numerical matrix that has a 1 in 12 arcsecond resolution and an equal map projection. What does that look like? This is the HYCOM shear stress map. This is on a log scale, so note that the values are very low. So bottom currents are actually very weak. If you compare the stresses to tidal stresses, things like that, these are much weaker. Now here's the sediment thickness GlobSed model, and then in combination with the lithospheric age, you can simply divide this thickness map by the age to get this sediment supply model, right? And now this gives us this quantitative control over these two main ingredients that we need to predict the contourites, right? Now, finally, to train the model, we need the dispersal of some mapped contourites, which is the Claus et al. Contourite Atlas. Of course, you cannot train your model using all your data. You need a subset of your data, and ideally, you would like a globally representative subset, and also one that is especially well mapped. So because of that, I chose this portion of the northern Atlantic Ocean, which contains some of these really well-mapped contourites. And it also has a really wide range of different environments with some very high shear stress, some very low shear stress, some very high sediment supply, some relatively low sediment supply. And you can use this to tell the computer which types of circumstances, so which kind of combination of shear stress and sediment supply is representative for the formation of contourites. It takes a little bit too much time to explain exactly how you do that, but it involves a process called hyperparameter optimization. So you basically tell the computer that every correctly predicted grid cell gives you 1 point, and then every wrongly predicted grid cell gives you -1 point. And then every set of input parameters gives you a total score. And then you try to figure out using all sorts of different algorithms to figure out how you get the highest score, right? Now, so what does this really look like? So this is a figure that has the Contourite Atlas on the top, and on the bottom it shows some frequency histograms of the sedimentation rate and the shear stress. So both of these parameters are log normally distributed, which means that if you put the x-axis on a logarithmic scale, then you can get these really nice normal distributions. And what this shows is that the sedimentation rates within the contourite outlines, as explained by the Contourite Atlas, are significantly higher than the global averages. And the same goes for these shear stresses. This kind of supports our initial assumption, right? That contourites tend to form where you have this relatively high values for sedimentation rates and shear stress. So that's actually very good. It's a good support for our most important assumption. Now, in using the previously explained data training method, you can actually figure out the boundaries that are most representative, most associated with the formation of these contourites. And then once you know those boundaries, you can separate the world into zones that are likely to form contourites, unlikely to form contourites, and likely to form erosion, right? Basically, by using these 4 boundaries, so the minimum shear stress for contourite formation, the maximum shear stress for contourite formation, the minimum sediment supply for contourite formation, and the maximum sediment supply for contourite formation, you can quantify 5 different regimes across the ocean, which I call deposition, erosion, and then 3 different types of stasis. Now, what does this look like graphically? So these are the same data, only plotted as a scatter plot, as a binned density scatter plot. So you basically have these data. Sorry, you basically have these data plotted against each other, and it gives you a nice, like, normally distributed blob of data. And like I explained previously, the contourites, they tend to form in the kind of in the top right of this total data plot, which shows you that they like to form in this region of relatively high sediment supply, relatively high shear stress, but not too high, right? If your shear stress is too high, then you're going to get an erosional system. If the sediment supply is too high, the system is most likely to be dominated by turbidity currents or other processes that are not bottom current related. So like I said, this gives you 5 different quantitatively defined regions, which are the contourites, the region that is within all these boundaries, the area of erosion, which has too much shear stress, the area of too much sediment, the one that has, and then finally the one that has the stasis, which is the region that has not enough sediment or not enough shear stress. And I color code these to show you to kind of graphically depict the prediction. The prediction looks like this, where the green areas are predicted to be contourites, and the red areas are predicted to be bottom current erosion, and then the blue areas are neither deposition nor erosion, so they're the stasis areas. Now, if you kind of overlay this Contourite Atlas, you can see that there's some degree of spatial correlation, right? Which is, of course, what you would expect to show in your prediction. Now, there are definitely regions that are not in this Contourite Atlas, but are predicted to have contourites, which of course doesn't necessarily mean that it's an over prediction. It could just simply be because the ocean is not mapped completely, that these areas, especially like in the southern Indian Ocean or the Southern Ocean around Antarctica, it could be that these areas actually contain contourites that have not been mapped at this point, right? And the third step in this process is to validate the prediction. So you simply overlay your mapped contourites with your prediction, and it shows you to which extent the prediction corresponds to what has been mapped. And it gives you some degree of accuracy, right? It gives you some sense of how accurate the prediction is. And in some cases, these really interesting, somewhat familiar patterns start to occur. So, for example, east of Greenland, you have the Eyrick drift, which is outside of the training data, so it's entirely formed as a prediction. And it does indeed predict that there should be this depositional system with this erosional moat next to it. So this moat and drift pattern that is well known amongst contourite researchers can also be it also emerges from this analysis, right? Which is an interesting result. Now, of course, if you really want to appreciate and fully understand what's going on, you also have to appreciate all the limitations that this sort of workflow has. So I've outlined 4 of the most important ones. The first is, what exactly is the spatial boundary of a contourite? Like the Contourite Atlas, which serves as the input training data set. Where does the contourite end exactly, right? It's not always completely clear, and that can have a really important effect on the final prediction. Also, the Contourite Atlas may, of course, contain flaws. Like it's made over many different sonar seismic studies, but it doesn't cover the whole world. And of course, some of it is largely interpretation, right?
Could you go to the summary, Dan? You're running out of time.
Okay, yeah. So the summary, here's some kind of generalized patterns on where these depositional, erosional, and stasis regions tend to occur. And finally, you can visualize all 5 different regimes at once, which gives you this this sort of distribution of where you're likely to find bottom current deposition, contourites, erosion, pelagic deposition, and also high sediment supply, so turbidite dominated regions. So that's the end. It's a little bit too long, I think, but
thank you. Thank you very much, Dan, for summarizing so efficiently. Beautiful maps, lots to think about. So we've run over time, so please put your questions to Dan in the question box or in the chat.